There we are.
There it is. Hey.
There we all being quiet.
We were so loud a few minutes ago.
That's right.
So welcome, virtually connecting from Open Ed, a whole series of conversations with a whole symphony of voices adding to the conversations today. Take it away from on-site.
Hi, I'm Chuck Pearson. I'm from Tusculum College in Greenville, Tennessee. I am here with the wonderful.
Hi, I'm Karen Cangialosi from the biology department at Keene State College in New Hampshire, and this is my first VC Connecting experience. I'm really excited to be here.
I'm Samantha, streamer Veneruso from Montgomery College in Maryland, and this is also my first VC Connecting experience.
I'm Alan Levine. I've done a couple of these, and first of all, they didn't include it in their introductions, but Karen is a fantastic singer and harmonica player.
Oh, the harp last night
A little bit of an exaggeration.
awesome.
No,
Thank
if you're
you,
up there on the
exaggerating.
stage at the Open EdTech Jam, which was a blast. But we probably
It was
met several years ago at Keene,
At Keene State,
when Mike
yeah.
Caulfield had me, and
Right?
we're neighbors because I grew up in Maryland.
Yeah,
true.
so did
Baltimore.
I actually.
Yeah.
Did you?
Yeah. I grew up
Really?
in Randallstown, which is just
And I grew up in Baltimore City.
Really?
Randallstown, Milford Mill High
There we
School.
go.
Wow, Randallstown and
Yeah.
Milford Mill. Yeah, we were like rivals.
So we're casual this morning.
So somehow you
That's
managed
so
to
funny.
put, Maha, you managed to put together a group that actually 3 of us are from the same place.
Yeah, Maryland.
Yeah, no, you're missing out on the parts where I let people who are in the same state find out that there's a hurricane happening in their state, but they don't know each other.
So we ought to let the virtual buddies introduce themselves and say hello. Helen, this is where I hand back to you.
And I will start. I'm Helen DeWard. I teach Faculty of Education in Central Ontario. And Michael.
Hi, this is Michael Berman. I'm coming to you from Camarillo, California, where I work at the California State College called Channel Islands, which is not on an island.
What a nice office, Michael. I've never seen your place.
That's my house.
Oh, okay.
It's still an office.
Still, that's why it's nice.
It's very nice.
Maha.
Yeah, I'm Mahabedi from the American University in Cairo in Egypt, and I'm at my in-laws' house.
Great.
And it
I
looks
saw
like
AK jump in.
Yeah.
Hi ho, neighbors. This is AK from Salem, Massachusetts. Today I'll be playing the role of Wilson.
I
you're a
see
man of
you
many
over the
hats.
fence.
Running, is it Helen running it?
Yeah.
It is officially Helen running it.
Okay,
So
Helen, can you tweet me the join link?
To Rebecca.
Yes, will do. And why don't we just get started with some general conversations about the conference and I'd say takeaways, insights.
Well, you were saying some
I think
things
for our
before we got
first-
started.
yeah.
You want to start with those
Oh, wait, what
ideas?
was I talking about? I don't know. They're gone. They're gone.
I think hugs. I think the theme was hugs, and this really needs Ken Bauer to be here, but
Right. Well, we actually all just heard Sarah Goldrick
Goldrick,
Robb speak this morning, which was really amazing and powerful. And I don't know about the rest of you, but really put us in this place of needing to think about so much bigger than just open ed, but about access to education, about inequities, about the fact that more and more people don't have the ability to go to college because of financial reasons. And so I've been thinking a lot about how does open ed fit into that social justice movement that we have to really be focusing on. It really resonated with Jameson Miller's talk yesterday as well.
Mhm. Yes.
I think yesterday I saw at Actual Ham and at that psych professor at their talk on free and open pedagogy. What is it? And I think Actual Ham did a really nice job of framing the idea of access, that there's been some conversation at the conference around sort of this dichotomy of, is OER and open about cost or is it about pedagogy? And there, it's almost like there's some tension between those two ideas, and there's been an ongoing metaphor of OERs being sort of a gateway or a gateway drug or a gateway sort of door. And it just, as things go, there's been some seeming tension around that. And I think that Actual Ham did a really nice job of framing that around access, that actually access is where those two things come together. So it's not just the access of providing free text, but it's also providing access so that the students can engage in it and be connected and be part and have learner-driven opportunities. And so by doing that, you're not only just providing the materials, they're taking responsibility for their own learning, and they're more engaged in it, and they're going to be more successful. Students are going to be more successful that way.
Yeah. Number one, I love that she is at actual ham, not Robin DeRosa.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
But number two, heard Robin DeRosa's talk at UNW's Digital Pedagogy Lab, which really got me thinking about a lot of this stuff, where she said that free should be the least exciting thing about open pedagogy. And free is really dang exciting. So it sets a level of expectation, and if you're around Robin, this level of energy that that really drives urgency. And listening to Sarah this morning hammered that home, that we have issues in front.
I think the one of the things that Sarah said that was really important was, she was, or I think the connection, she didn't overtly make the connection to open education or open pedagogy, besides obviously the reducing costs for students. But, students have to make a whole lot of choices. And, when they're making choices about whether to come to class or whether to take that extra shift and whether to, skip the bus so that they can eat that day to get to school, if we have open pedagogy that's got them engaged in what they're doing, the cost of missing class is much higher, because it's a very personal and intellectual cost beyond just the essentials. And so, yeah, we can take care of all the infrastructure things. I don't know if we can, but if we could take care of all the infrastructure things that that are barriers, but we're not also engaging students in what they're doing, then it doesn't matter as much.
I gotta say, that was not only hammered, Chuck, that was a gut punch.
Yeah, it was.
And frankly, I feel like there's like this huge mythology about what college is and the reality of it, that I kind of feel part of.
Yeah, we created it with something we have built systemically that we experienced when we were students and we wanted to buy into. And now we look around and see what our students actually go through now. Yeah, that mythology has to get torn down.
But the systems that are built to help students get to college are kind of,
they're broken.
You're right. And I know Sarah's work is based in the U.S., and so I think we need to remember that these are like global issues too. But I think a lot of us as privileged Americans are kind of shocked to hear statistics like 24% of our students have to worry about just having enough food, that they're just hungry when they're in the classroom, and that's really shocking. And I think also that when she talked at the end about what it is that we need to do, that there were those 3 bullet points, and I had actually tweeted out that number 3 about the need to develop a more inclusive and a less judgmental system. I think that's where open ed could really focus its energy in a way that it hasn't before. How can we think about how we offer educational experiences, how we bring in learning, that connects with the Bonnie Stewart's ideas of narratives, right? If you tell your narrative about how you're learning and what you're learning and why you want to learn it, then, and how do we as a movement provide that access so that it doesn't become so much of the degree of inequity that there is right now.
And I love that. And I love that.
Go on.
The thing that she mentioned that she's personally doing is contributing money to this emergency fund.
FAST fund, yes.
FAST fund that doesn't go to the system, but goes to faculty who know the situation that their students are in. And that's a real radical, warm approach.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
I was just wanting to say something about how, finding ways to help students without asking them to tell their story, because they might not want to tell their story. We always talk about telling stories as if that's an empowering thing, which it is for some people. It is often more empowering to tell your story when it's been solved. So Tressie talked on her blog about a situation where she needed like $25 or something to be able to do something, and she had to borrow like $20 from someone and $5 from someone else. It was something like that. She's telling this story now. I'm pretty sure she didn't really want to tell that story back then because it would be really humiliating. And how do you do things, whatever kinds of things we do, how do we do them in ways that we don't actually force students to come and ask for something.
That's a really,
because
that's
some
a
people's
really,
pride. There's this game called Spent where you try pretending to be a poor person and you play it. And there are parts of it where you ask the help of a friend because you've run out of money.
huh,
And when you press that button, you go to Facebook or Twitter and you tweet it out.
huh.
And knowing that I'm not poor, but just playing that and knowing that I'm just going to go post on Twitter, can someone lend me money? It's so painful.
Yes.
I've never been poor, but that's how someone would feel. And so just thinking about this, telling stories, a lot of times it's not, you don't want to tell that story now, or you don't want to tell that story publicly, or you don't want to tell it to your teacher, or you know what I mean?
That's a
And
really great.
I value it, and
That's
the
a
ones
really
who do
great
share, it's good, but you got to give people a way to help them without doing that.
Yeah, and I think that also speaks to the fact that a lot of us that are looking at ways of doing our pedagogy different need to hear those kinds of things, like tell me how to do it. I think actually connecting back to some of the feminist pedagogy ideals that came out in the 60s and 70s, that you talked about going back to the 70s, and that there are ways that people have approached getting at these issues, and that the open ed people need to kind of connect back to.
But I like the thing she talked about, sorry, the giving breakfast to everybody, not
Yeah, not
sing,
just- yeah.
not
Yeah.
single out, oh, you're
the one that needs
poor
it, yeah.
and we're holding pity on you. And kids who have breakfast won't take the free breakfast, and kids
Yeah.
who don't have it will appreciate even a bad breakfast.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to jump in. I was interested to hear about Sarah's project and raising money for faculty to give to students, and it struck me that on my campus, that faculty as a group would probably be the least likely to recognize that some of these kids are struggling. A lot of times it's an administrative assistant in a department office, or it's somebody in student affairs, because the students often are going to connect more with a 30-year-old Hispanic person working in student affairs than they are with the 55-year-old white professor. So building a community of care that includes everybody, faculty being part of that community, but sort of everyone on campus is certainly an ideal that my campus has. I'm sure we don't live up to it nearly as often as we should.
I guess there's differences in different places. I know I can just speak about my own colleagues in my department that are keenly aware of the economic situation of our students that are in our offices all the time and talking to us one-on-one. So there can be big differences in
Sure.
How we recruit faculty in terms of what we want them to be able to do and know and experience is a whole nother part of it as well.
And then there's the issue that we have poverty among our faculty as well.
I was going to say, I think for us at a two-year school, I mean, we have a lot of part-time faculty, although we don't have as many places do. But I think our part-time faculty often have connections with students around this issue a lot, and they will often, students will often go to them and feel connected to them because they do. So.
This, of course, maybe in the 70s, they wouldn't think we'd be talking about this
Yeah.
as an issue. I mean,
Well, it's
yeah.
gotten worse.
It's gotten worse, yeah,
Like the
yeah.
inequities are just the gaps have grown and have
Yeah.
gotten worse. Funding for public education has been way down. You talk about Robin's work, like
Yes.
beating the bandwagon about how public education has just been dying and the access has been, just abysmal. So.
Yes.
We're looking at cuts in our system, just like Plymouth had cuts, and
Mhm.
we're all just kind of scratching our heads, like thinking about, well, how can open ed actually start to address that, and worrying about being too late in some ways.
Sure.
That was depressing.
sure, so come on, put a hat on.
But it does connect to the conversation we had earlier this morning with Viv and David around tenure, and how tenure is kind of a block to being open.
Well, it's a contradiction, tenure as a means for academic freedom versus tenure as a signifier of status and a creator of inequity, and it's both.
Yeah.
I'm watching a Twitter stream here, and Brittany Brown O'Donnell, thank you for watching us, by the way. She just tossed a question about talking about people's stories and when issues come up and they have to say something. And she asked, how do we reconcile the timing of storytelling? How do we not force people to tell something they're uncomfortable with? Can we change how we value openness and transparency?
Ooh, I have an idea.
Please.
I do these. I do these, and Rebecca knows this because she's worked with me a lot. I do these semi-fictional narratives where I try to tell a story that's really a lot of true stories into one story to make a point, and it's exaggerated a little bit because it's all the things in one story. But I'm not referring to a particular person. And I like ethnographic research where I say that it's me and all that, but sometimes I'm talking about other people, and I don't want to point at who they are. And so that's maybe something that we could encourage our students to do, like just telling stories that aren't necessarily saying that this happened to me, but just saying a story. And then, you know, as they become less vulnerable, they might be willing to say I and say that this is actually me and it's not fictional. But when they feel comfortable, like I'm just thinking, there was this research we wanted to do about imposter syndrome.
Yeah.
And it was a bit tricky because any story about imposter syndrome, you're likely, especially they were all women, you're likely to have something to say about your supervisor or your father or your brother or, you know, all these men in our lives. And you don't want to, you still love these people, you don't want to hurt them, but they, you know, they've contributed to your imposter syndrome or something. And I was thinking that maybe one of the ways to do it is to just sort of collect little bits of all our stories and make them into like a semi-fictional narrative of one person.
That's a really neat idea.
I don't know what you guys think of that.
I think it's a great idea.
Yeah.
So yesterday I got to hear Mike Caulfield talk about the article that he wrote about the institutionalization, but he extended on that and really talked about the hidden infrastructure and understanding the hidden infrastructure, that we make so many decisions that we make based off of what we assume is supposed to happen and the way it's supposed to be, but we don't really take time to dive into what the actual real barriers are. And he used the metaphor of a bike lane to do that. I think that Heather's point is good, that we don't necessarily need Chuck's story right now, but we need people who've experienced it afterwards when they're ready to share, and we need to hear those stories so that we can understand what's happening, so that we can fix it in ways where we're not asking you to disclose or feel vulnerable, like everybody gets lunch, you can choose it or not choose it, but everybody gets it. Everybody gets breakfast, you can choose it or not choose it. Everybody gets a free transportation pass, whether you use it or don't use it. Everybody gets free books. If you choose to go buy a book, then that's fine. Everybody gets, you know, so that we're understanding by having the opportunity. And I think Sarah Goldberg-Rabb's research and her book really dives into how they did that. And so that research exists of the stories of who we have. It challenges the framework and the understanding that we have. And so if we look at that and then on our own institutions, follow and just start being aware of what kind of barriers there are without necessarily going directly to that individual student, but still creating space for those students who want to come and disclose to be able to do that. So I think that there's something incumbent on us to change our own mental frameworks.
Yes.
And that's what, I mean, I think that it's not so much that we have to force students to disclose. It's that,
well, the word force is just, we shouldn't be
Well,
forcing
let's talk about the
right.
other.
Well, I don't think we should be. I mean, that's,
right,
you know.
right.
The other side here is, I mean, there's one thing about asking students, forcing them to disclose. If we want their stories, we have to earn their trust.
Right.
Yeah.
And you know, what I got from Sarah is that she got the stories when she asked the questions that other people were not asking them, and it more or less it honored their stories and said, wait a minute, someone actually sees my FU'd situation. And she said they were right in the margins of the survey. And so
thank you for asking about this. Nobody else cares. Students want to be heard. Students want to be heard. Students want to be heard. By the way,
but they don't necessarily want to be in the spotlight. They want to be heard, but they don't want to necessarily be put on the spot because of that sense of embarrassment.
So how do we create the space for students to be heard in their position where they are at themselves? Rebecca.
So, as a participatory research, I find it interesting that we're having this conversation, but the person we're trying to help is not in the room.
Oh, yeah.
And so it's like we kind of need them to be part of the solution in order for the solution to work.
I think it's so fascinating that the thing I haven't expected to get out of being here was the conversations around narrative. Being in Kate Bowles' presentation and Laura Gogia coming up and giving her narrative story and then using that as a launching point into how do we honor narrative and how do we take narrative seriously in an unbiased fashion as we do research, not just turning students into numbers or data points, but actually bringing their stories to bear. Maha, you're talking about semi-fictional narratives. That's a great take, and it's a perspective I'd not heard before, but it's really valuable.
Creative nonfiction.
Yes.
There's a lot of movement out, that I've been hearing about faculty talking about their own failures and their own, how they came back from those failures, because a lot of times faculty or students don't necessarily see that, well, of course, you've got the degrees, you're here, you can't possibly understand my experience.
Right.
And so, finding, back to the idea of narrative, as a faculty member, finding ways to tell your stories of failure that show that, no, actually, it wasn't quite as easy as you might think it was, and here's how I recovered, here's how I used failure to learn, and those kinds of things. It makes a level of vulnerability. And I think that, one of the things that happened in the room on Twitter as Sarah was talking was the number of people who said, that was my story going through my master's program. That was my story when I was in community college. That was my story here. So I think that's kind of two separate pieces, but I do think that that story, that thread of narrative and that thread of talking, and being willing to share your story, your story.
Yeah, like making ourselves vulnerable goes back to what Ellen was saying about gaining their trust.
Right.
Is that doing, make yourself vulnerable before you ask them to take risks. And the other thing that Rebecca was just saying is that students not being in the room, by the way, having them in the room doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be comfortable. And we talked about that as another session. They can be in a room but feel very, very stressed, or they feel like, oh, like we have students on our committees. We have like 10 faculty and 1 student. Really? Right. And that's gonna let the students express themselves. They're just sitting there bored out of their bored out of their minds, because the committee meeting was not made for them, right? So it's about how do you create a space for the students to be part of this conversation and not assume what they need, but give them space to decide what they need.
Really interesting, like what you were saying, Chuck, about how students want to tell their stories, and I don't have the answers for how we best get them to do that or do it so that it's safe for them, but I know that even in like my science course, where I'm asking them to write about topics that seem pretty general, that they often like to bring it back to their own experience, and that they find a way to tell their story just to answer a scientific hypothesis question. And so they're really, there's definitely a need for them to relate their experience, and that they'll find ways to get their stories heard, even when we're not cultivating as much as we should be. So it's just an interesting observation.
Let me bring Donna Longclose's voice into this thing. She's asking on Twitter, how do we encourage stories without demanding? And she suggests, by telling our own first on our own terms. Is our voice going to be helpful in drawing students' stories out?
I know our stories could be so different. I part of my story is going to college from 1978 to 1982 is that a Pell Grant paid for almost 100% of my tuition.
Right, yeah.
So that's a really different experience. And maybe it's saying, well, we had this. You guys should be like really upset about this now. I
have a lot of stories of academic struggle, and I can bring that to the table in a relatable way. Economic struggle is not a place where I was. It just wasn't. And again, it's a product of a completely different time.
It's a risk. I mean, you never know how your story is heard.
Yeah.
Right.
And so the last thing you want to do is come off as some kind of pandering, empathy washing. Is that a thing? But there's no way to know. And so, people aren't going to transmit their reactions to you. So, I mean, as a teacher or the leader in the room, I mean, you have this kind of balled in sort of voice in that room. And
Yeah,
so
absolutely. So that
I don't
goes
know
to
how you
sort
do
of
it, yeah.
democratizing the classroom and creating the safe spaces
Yeah.
and not having the professor be the only voice that counts, like setting all of those kinds of pedagogies that have been out there that we need to probably read more about as open educators.
I think frankly, I mean, I agree that like, some stories will reach some students. I think if we got better at asking questions, like sincere, sincere, concerned questions.
And the personal.
I think it's if we get better at listening
Yes.
to what they're saying, and not just the voices that are the vocal voices. It really takes listening to, sitting beside and listening to students talk to.
Oh, Helen, that is everything. That is absolutely everything, because we all know, we've been in charge of rooms where we can tell the 3 or 4 people who are going to dominate. And God knows I can dominate real well my own self. Thank you. I don't need more of me. I don't need more of me at all. There are so many voices who don't get brought out.
I have no idea what you're talking about, Chuck.
I don't know.
Michael, I think you need to bring up the point you wrote in the chat.
Well, one of my heroes, Michelle Pakinski-Brock, who I work with on my campus, has very compellingly told some amazing stories about students finding their own story through different modes of expression. And I've seen this in my own time when I was in the classroom, that sometimes a student who has a very difficult time expressing themselves, and especially in front of a group, might be able. Some can write, some can create a video, some can do a painting or take a photograph. And I think that traditionally in higher education, we valued certain forms of expression much more than others. And I think as we get better at, I mean, I'm not talking about learning styles, I'm talking about forms of expression. And I think that the more we can learn to value more varied forms of expression, the more room there is for different student voices.
That's great.
I can't see anything that's going on in the chat, so I don't know if there's other things that we should follow up on.
It's like you see it moving by.
Yeah,
it looks fascinating.
AK is the last person who had a take, so let's bring him in.
I've actually been in and out, so I've got this last part, and I was actually trying to brainstorm because I heard something about Pell Grants, and I definitely benefited from that. My undergrad education was mostly paid for that, and I went to college at a time when now it seems so cheap. Back then it seemed expensive, $8,000 a year for an undergrad state school. So I tend to teach graduate courses, so I'm kind of wondering what are the differences between undergrad and grad students, because I've never had the privilege of teaching undergrad. So where do these narratives of openness and being inclusive with our students and taking in their voices come into graduate programs? How do those differ from undergrad? I am definitely ignorant on the topic.
Answers for all 3 of us, and because we're at 3 different classes of institutions. So I'm at a small independent school, and you're at a four-year state university, and Montgomery is the urban 2-year college. So
well, and as far as graduate programs, I mean, they're so diverse as well, and there are some that are easier to access than others. There are like for-profit graduate degrees that are bleeding students dry with tuition cost, and then there are places that are highly competitive where students can get tuition waivers and stipends. And I think, again, I go back to my experience that those were easier to get when I went to graduate school than they are now.
Yes. I would hate to see Sarah's research on how many of the students she talked to are actually in graduate school.
Yeah.
It's got to be marginal.
And So it's, from my perspective, AK, it's all kinds of different voices that you wind up hearing. It's a far more diverse group than even when you get into a very diverse graduate program. It's Go.
I would say that from my experience, and we have a range of students at my institution, but for many students, they have no real conception. They have the conception of, okay, I'm going to finish my degree here. I'm going to transfer. Actually, I'm not going to finish my degree. I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to transfer, and then I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to become a lawyer or an engineer or this or that. And they don't really, because they haven't had it modeled, they don't really know what that means and how many years that is. And even when you sit down and map it, sometimes it's like, well, okay, I can see that on paper, but they have, and I thought that was really interesting in Sarah's talk. She talked about the kind of, they don't question the students that she found that the students had this economic thread, this imperative that they were going to go do this because this is what they have to do to get a good job, and this is just what they're going to do, but they don't really know what that means. And and they don't have a really, because they haven't, many of my students haven't seen that modeled, and so they don't know what does it really take to do that, and what does it feel like to be in school for 6 years straight or 7 years. And so when they extend the 2-year school, so, it's a 2-year degree, but now it's taking you 5 years. And at 5 years, like, oh God, how long is it going to take me to get up to my BA? And then it's like, oh, and now I have to go do master's program. How many years is that going to take me? So I think for many students at my level, especially when they're going 1 class at a time or 2 classes at a time, because that's all they can afford to do, that long term, that it's like, yes, I'm going to do this is aspirational, but the reality drags them down somewhere along the way.
But at least there's that idea of the recognition possibly, even with graduate students. You see the student, but do you know their family situation?
Right, you don't have
do you know what they're dealing with? Do you know the sacrifice maybe one partner made so they could go, or the fact that they're raising kids, or that their housing situation is marginal.
Or what it took them to get there.
Yeah.
So what else? There was another little
What else you got?
let's ignore the for-profits for now. How can we ignore the for-profits? Good. I want them
Well,
to.
they're draining students. They're taking advantage of students that don't need.
They're making promises that are not,
that can't be kept.
It's part of the whole
So
corporate.
let me bring up ask you all a question and plug something that I think is really interesting. I wonder how many of you have listened to the podcast that Michael Wesch did, where he essentially did an ethnographical study of his own students.
Yeah.
Because that's another kind of difference. He was thinking particularly about age, the age difference between the instructors and the students, and how that sometimes makes it harder to listen because of not coming from the same world. But anyway, I would strongly recommend it. It was fascinating, and I would also really encourage all of us to think about ways we could be inspired by that and do our own other ways. It's another kind of listening to the students.
Michael, that's the Life 101 podcast.
Yeah.
Yes, and that's so valuable. But Michael Wesch is so good at being so honest about where he stands. And that was born for him out of a realization that, I had it with my students once, and I was together with my students. I was on the same page with them.
Right.
Things happened and I'm not there anymore. How do I get back to a place where I can be listening to their voices and hearing them clearly? And he just took and spent time with his students and did crazy things. And it's a wonderful set of stories to be told.
Yep. And then he's such a good storyteller too. So
the best. The best. So yeah.
Big fan. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Although,
I haven't heard the podcast.
That took him 6 months to produce, by the way.
Wow.
It was a very intentional project.
So what are some of the other major takeaways that you guys are going home with? This is my first time at this conference.
Oh,
so,
really? It's my
been
second
interesting.
time.
Oh, I have a question for you, Samantha. Did you go up to the people you wanted to talk to and say hi?
I did. I was my entire Twitter list is here except for you guys who aren't. But Maha, you're not here. So you're here, but you're not here. You know what I mean? So yes, I have. I've met I think just about everybody I expected to meet. So it was great. It was fabulous. And we were talking earlier about hugs. There was this, this whole thing about hugs, and this is a very huggy conference. Everybody's hugging.
I can confirm that because she came up and she introduced herself.
I did
At breakfast. And she said, "Is this an okay thing to do to ask? I know you on Twitter."
They were at breakfast, and Ken had just tweeted out a picture of him, and I'm sitting at breakfast, and I went, wait, I see that guy in that picture right there. So I walked over and interrupted their breakfast.
I sound like an old person, but like my first conferences in the 90s, there was no way to do that.
Right.
And basically you had to, get up the gumption to stare at someone's name tag.
Right.
And what the potential that it offers, and the fact that, you would take advantage of that.
Well, we say that, and we say, yes, we had no way to do that, but scientific meetings, there's not a whole lot of hugging that went on at Biophysical Society.
It depends. I mean,
There are some. I'm going to grant,
Arachnology
but
Society is pretty huggy.
okay. Cool, awesome. That may be my people, but yeah, physical scientists don't tend to do this much. And so the welcome that comes, I've mentioned this before, that this is a place where that psych prof mentioned it referring to actual ham, Rajiv being so open, saying, we're in a community that does welcome and does allow us even to get the space to work with some of our heroes. Lee Bissett and I having so many great conversations over the course of this week.
But we should also recognize that there's a huge number of people here.
Yeah.
So there could be people that are feeling isolated,
Oh, there are
disconnected, and don't know how to.
You guys have no idea how much this conversation is scaring me.
Yes.
Because
yes,
I'm a very affectionate person.
Yeah.
But I also don't want to hug every single person, right? I'm not actually okay with that, and some people don't understand culturally, but I'm not very consistent, so I will confuse the heck out of you.
What I will say,
when I'm on site.
Never unsolicited hugs. It was always is it okay if I give you a hug? And those kinds of
people don't always do that. I've had these experiences, and what if I want to hug you but not the person next to you,
right?
And I can't help but hug you, so the other person just assume these things happen, right? So, and then how do you explain to someone that it's not a lack of affection, it's just that I actually don't know you well enough to we're not at that stage yet. And I'm so accessible online that people, I think, tend to assume that I should be like that, and I'm accessible otherwise, but it's just that thing. And so I'm just going back to what Chuck was saying about being open, being open and inclusive and welcoming. What someone considers welcoming is not necessarily the same in every culture. It's not necessarily the same for every person. So, for example, when Amy Collier was here in Egypt, she had very, very strict dietary needs, and it's actually quite insulting to Egyptians that you don't eat. And so I'm always like, oh, could you eat something? And it's probably annoying. And she understood that, and I understood what was going on. But it's just like, I have to try to offer her food, And I flipped that one day they had vermicelli in the rice because that meant it wasn't gluten-free. But I forgot that she wasn't eating rice in the first place. but anyway, you know what I mean? It's just welcoming is contextual. Absolutely. And even though I assume that I would feel welcome, or that I would understand that people intend to be welcoming, that doesn't necessarily mean that
everybody feels.
And not everybody is on Twitter the way we are. Not everybody knows us the way. We always say this about virtually connecting as well. We're like, oh, anybody come, but not everybody's comfortable being on video. And I can tell just when we have people for the first time that one person might be a little bit more comfortable than another, or that a certain track of conversation is less comfortable. There were people who passed by behind you, and we forgot to get their permission. I mean, they didn't mean to be on the live stream, but they were. And what if they had a problem with that? Yeah. There's all these little things that unintentionally happen.
That's true. Yeah.
You can go a long way with a smile too.
Yeah.
It is nice to have a longer conversation.
Yeah.
I think in the context of talking about welcoming, I mean, somebody brought up in one of the sessions at the end, the presentation was 22 minutes long, and then we have a second for questions, and then we have to get up and leave and go to the next session. And they felt very sort of bad about the fact that we weren't actually modeling what open pedagogy is about, which is to be able to hear each other and share ideas and be open. But the whole structure of the conference doesn't always allow for that. So that may not have felt very welcoming.
Sure.
So not to criticize the conference organizers, it's just kind of challenging.
But we're fighting against what a conference is. We have a limited amount of time. There's a lot of stuff we want to talk about and a lot of people we have, but it's been so dense. It just has.
That was
And the whole issue of getting funding to come requires presentations, which means you actually don't necessarily, they're not all good presentations, and in part because they're only doing it because they needed to do it
to be here
in the first place. And I think that model, we need to figure out a way to disrupt that model.
Yes.
Yeah.
It was said yesterday, and our friend Gail Maha, there's a session, I didn't figure out what session it was, but David was in the room, and Gail basically said that there's not enough space for some of these conversations to happen. And he did acknowledge it. And like Gail, she says, I will give up my presentation.
I was thinking, why don't we flip our conferences the way we flip classrooms sometimes, put presentations up, and then the conference is all about discussion.
That's been my dream.
Yes, yes. There was one of the European MOOCs conferences, not this year, but last year, they did that. I think it didn't work out very well, and they didn't do it for everything, but they did do it. They put some of the presentations on edX, I think.
Did it work?
And then
did it work?
They say it didn't, no, because they were like students. They didn't watch the videos.
Yeah.
But I think if you make them really short and really compelling, maybe they will. But we thought of doing a virtually connecting type of conference that was like that, where you just write a short blog post and then you have a conversation after that or something.
Right. Yeah, who's got the time? I mean, that is true, but
the conference gives us that opportunity to have dedicated time.
Speaking of time, I think it's our lunchtime.
And we're starting to get more traffic in the room. So any other quick things before we can shut this down?
I guess based on this and yesterday's virtually connecting, the key takeaway is practice what you preach.
Amen.
Yes, very much. That's a great place to end.
that's good.
Helen,
Thanks so much for taking the time.
All our virtual buddies for being with us.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me, Maha.
Thank you, Maha. Appreciate it.
Great
Hope to see you soon, Maha.
And
Thank you, everybody. See you soon.
And we'll end our broadcast.